In this video, we'll talk about the new custom control that can be added to the UX components. This custom control lives over here in the other controls section, and we'll talk about some of the use cases for this control. So in this particular example over here, I have a form that uses a custom control, and when I go over to render it over here, I see that basically what it looks like is a regular UX component form, but in this particular case the form controls here have been generated dynamically from a definition. So we're going to come back to this component later on, but we'll first now go through the basics of the custom control. So let's go here and start out now with a really simple UX component that has a custom control on it. So actually that's not where I want to start. I want to start with this one over here, and we'll see here that basically this custom control, which again is this control over here, not in data control, sorry, in other controls. There's custom control over here. It's defined basically by specifying some HTML that you want to render. So right now we just have a simple paragraph, some JavaScript that you'd like to execute before the UX component is prepared, and some JavaScript to execute after it has been rendered. So in this case I've not even defined those two controls, those two properties. So when I run this component, I just simply see the HTML that was generated by my control. And this HTML was defined at design time. Now we can also specify the custom control properties by using an XBasic function, and in this next example we're going to look at over here, we're going to change from specify now to simple XBasic. So if we go now back to our controls, we see that we've now basically set this custom controls method to XBasic, and we've specified an XBasic function called xb1. And if we go look at our XBasic functions now, we see there's xb1, and xb1 basically needs to set the properties that would otherwise have been defined at design time. So we set here e.html, and then we can optionally set JavaScript before prepare and JavaScript after render, and these before prepare and after render correspond to the client-side events before prepare and after render. So going back here, we can see that there's our HTML, and we've added in some XBasic over here to get the current time. So when we render this component right now, we get our string of text plus the current time on the server at the time the component was rendered. So this is again now a super simple example. Now let's take this up to the next level, and again we're going to basically use an XBasic function to generate the HTML, but in this case you can see we've also got submit and reset buttons. These are the standard submit and reset buttons that you would get by going to defined controls, and these submit and reset buttons are have enable events that cause them to go enabled if the form itself is dirty. And the custom control here, again as we've shown in the previous examples, is using XBasic, but in this case the XBasic is actually generating HTML for an input control. So when we go now and we run this, we see we have an input control, but you'll notice that like a normal UX component, when I type into this control, one would expect the submit button to become enabled because the form is now dirty, but in fact the submit button doesn't become enabled because we haven't executed any of the JavaScript necessary to make this into a real input control that the UX component understands. We haven't specified our JavaScript before prepare event, and we also haven't followed any of the required naming conventions over here. So let's pause and pick this up in the next video where we show how you can make this into a real input control. So we're continuing now talking about custom controls, and we have some HTML here that generates an input control, but as you can see when we type into the control, it does not behave like a standard input control. The UX component didn't go dirty. So now let's go basically to a more complex example here. And again, we just have our three controls. We have our custom control and then the submit and the reset buttons. And again, the custom control is using XBasic to generate the HTML and JavaScript. But if we go now and look at the XBasic function, we'll see that our input control now follows a naming convention that the UX component uses. So our field is called field 1, but the name of the field has to be v.r1. So the v.r1 comes from historical reasons. The grid component used v.r1 for the first row in the grid and v.r2 for the second row in the grid. So it's just a convention, and it's a required convention. And then the ID of the control basically has to be the same as the name, with the component alias as a prefix. So there's dialog.component name, which is the placeholder for the component alias. So this is the convention for the naming of fields in a UX component. And then we also need to basically execute some JavaScript that indicates that this is a field and tells the UX component information about the field. So in this particular case, we execute this code here to add the field called field 1 to the column info collection, and we specify certain properties of the control over here. So if we go now and run this component, we see that it looks just like it did in the previous case. We've got our input control there, but as soon as we type into that field, now you can see that the dialog goes dirty and the submit button becomes enabled. And if we were to go to our server-side events and put a debug 1 into the after dialog validate now, and then type in a value and then hit submit, we would see that in data.submitted, so e.data, that we have field 1 with its value. So basically we've generated HTML and JavaScript that have turned the generated HTML into a real input control that has all of the properties that a standard input control on a UX component has. Now I should also point out that in the XBasic that we generated, you can see that we followed a naming convention for the input control there, and we generated this code here for the JavaScript before prepare. But in fact we can use the UX builder to actually help us generate the correct code. So if I were to go here and add another standard text box over here called, say, text 1, and then switch over to the XBasic view here to look at the properties of that control. If I scroll down all the way to the precal control HTML, I can see here what the input control looks like. So that actually tells me what I need to generate for the HTML, and I can also see the column info that got generated over here. So that gives me the clue as to how the JavaScript should be generated. So now that we have the background of how the custom control works and how you need to generate HTML and JavaScript at runtime, we can go back to the example we showed at the beginning of the video where we had a complete form that was generated at runtime. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So now we're back to our dynamic form that we showed at the beginning of the video, and you can see here we have an input form, but on the controls here we only have a single control called custom control, and this custom control calls an XBasic function that is generating this form on the fly, and it's a real form. So if I go here and type in, say, Fred Smith and submit now without having filled in the remaining values, you can see we get data validation errors. And if I now go here and fill in the remaining fields, say 12, 20, 1, 2, whatever, hit submit. You can see now that that error went away. And then if I go there and fill in those two values, I can actually submit the data and store it in a database. So I'll come back and demonstrate submitting a little later, but let's go back now and take a look at what's happening behind the scenes here. So the custom control calls xb1. So let's go now and take a look at xb1. So here's our function xb1. And you can see that in this case, to keep things simple, we've defined the form using a string of JSON data. But in a real-world application where you wanted to have dynamic forms, you'd probably store the form definition in a database. So you'd start out by making a query against the database to actually get the form definition. But as I said, to keep things simple here, we're going to just start out using a hard-coded string of JSON. And this JSON here represents an array, so you can see the square brackets over there. And then each item in the array is an object that has a field name property, a control type property, so this is text box, a label property, and then a required property which sets either true or false. So first name and last name are text boxes, date of birth is a text box, favorite color is a radio button, and you can see that we've defined the choices for that radio button. And then you can see that skills is a checkbox. And then for the skills field, we specified that you can that the choices are defined over there, and then we've also specified allow multiple selections has been set to true to indicate that the user can check more than one skill. So this definition now drives some XBasic code here, which is going to generate the HTML. So when we look at this XBasic code, we see that what we're doing is first we define a template for an individual text box control. So the template uses the required naming conventions that we've discussed earlier, and the template puts the each field in its own row in a table with the field label in the first column and the actual input field in the second column. So this is just the format that I decided to use. You could certainly choose a different HTML template. You don't have to put it into a table, but this just keeps it nice and simple. So then what we do is we loop through, we pass this this definition to get it into an XBasic array. And now once we have it in an XBasic array, we get the size of the array, and then we start looping through the array, generating the HTML and the JavaScript. So you can see that if it's a text box, we take this template, and then we replace in the template the field name placeholder and the field label placeholder with the data from the definition. So PI field name is the field name, and PI field label is the field label, and that gives us the HTML that we need to generate. But we also need to generate the JavaScript before prepare, and that's done in this code over here. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're continuing now discussing how we can generate the form definition dynamically at runtime using XBasic. And you'll recall from an earlier discussion of how we basically made this component here, how we made this field into a real field, that we had to generate some, we have to have some generated JavaScript that goes in the before prepare event that looks like this over here. So we have an info.controlType property, hidden value, etc. So we need to generate this JavaScript over there. So let's go back now and take a look at what we have. So in order to generate that JSON string, we use the var2JSON XBasic function, which takes an XBasic dot variable and generates a JSON string. So we start out here, we create an XBasic dot variable called PJ, and then we start setting properties. So we say info.controlType equals text box. We set these other values here. Then we basically we generate this JavaScript code here where we say that we define the column info object. Here's the field name, and we use uppercase on that, and then here's var to JSON. So this is going to turn these xbasic dot variables into a JSON object, and then this array entry here, JavaScript before prepare, is going to match exactly this pattern that we require over there. So that's the pattern that we generate for text box controls. Then for radio button controls, you can see we use a control type of radio button, and then for checkbox controls, you can see we set the control type to checkbox. Now there's one other thing I want to point out, that in the case of the generated HTML for a checkbox, since we specified that allow multiple selections was true, the name of the field name of the control is needs to use square brackets to indicate array syntax. So there are two useful xbasic helper functions, A5W checkboxes and A5W radio buttons, that generate HTML for checkbox and radio button controls from a series of input values. So in this case, the radio buttons function takes choices, which is a CRLF delimited list, which we get from our JSON definition, and then we've specified the field name using the required naming convention, and we've also specified the ID, again using the required naming convention. But in the case here of checkboxes, where we have allow multiple selections set to true, we're going to add the name suffix onto the name that we pass into the checkbox control over here. So you can see we're adding name suffix over there. So that's going to generate the right HTML, and then you can see that now that we've got the HTML set in the HTML property of the array, we just simply dump it out, add in the required beginning table and end table functions, and then set e.html to our generated HTML, and then we also dump out the JavaScript before prepare and set e.javascript to that value over there, and now we've completely generated all of the required properties, e.html and e.javascript before prepare. We've generated all of that from our definition over here, which, as I mentioned earlier, could have come from a database. So let's pause now and look at the final step as to how this form can get submitted and then stored in a database. So we're continuing our discussion now, and we've just described how this definition over here can be turned into the HTML and JavaScript needed to actually run the form. And if we go and just put a debug at the very end over here, let's just go there and put in a debug one so we can look in the debugger as to what happened. So here we go, and if we run this now, we can see that HTML form now represents the HTML that has been generated from that definition. We're going to go there and add table tags into it, then replace dialog.style with the actual current style that we're using, which is GR blue. Then we're going to basically dump out the JavaScript before prepare from our array, which gives us all of the JavaScript that needs to be executed before the form is prepared, and we set that to e.javascript before prepare, and then when we actually run it, we see our form over there, and then as soon as I type a value, the form goes dirty. If I leave anything blank, the form reports the errors. So let's go and see now how this error code is generated. But before doing that, let's go and actually create a standard UX component with some controls, and then see what JavaScript is necessary to report errors. So I'm going to go over here and let's put some controls on over there. So I'll go there and say text 1, and I'll just go here and make this into a required field. So I'll go and stick some XBasic validation code on, and I'll also go to server-side code here to the dialog.validate, and I'll set that to true, and I'll put in some error. And then what I'm going to do is run this in a browser and look at the response that the alpha server sent back when we submitted the form. Oh, I need to put, sorry about that, I need to go here and actually put submit buttons on there. So let's go here and hit the submit reset, save that, go ahead now and run this, and let's switch over to console, hit that, now make it blank so I can hit the submit button, and you can see now that we got our error at the field level, and we also got our global error. So if we go and look here, we can see that the global error got set automatically because we set the has errors property to true, but the error that is defined at the field level over here got set by this piece of code here. It calls the .set errors method, and the set errors method takes an array of fields to set errors on, and each item in the array has an ID property, which is the ID of the field, and then the message, which is the actual message to display. So now that we know that, let's go back now, go back to our form and look at the code that we execute in the server-side dialog validate. So we have our form definition, which I've just copied here from the this XBasic function. So this is the form definition that we're using to create our dynamic form. So in a real application, you would have retrieved this from a database. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this required field property here to decide whether we need to generate an error message. So when we take this definition, we pass it into an XBasic array, and now we loop over the array, checking to see whether the data submitted for that field, checking to see first of all whether the field itself is required, and if it is required, then was any data submitted, and then if the data was not submitted, then we basically create the error text, and we say that that field name is required. Now in the case of the checkbox control, which is a multi-select control, the data that is submitted will be in the form of an array, in which case we need to basically dump out the array to get all of the values in the array. So let's put a debug one statement over here, and then loop over the data at runtime and see how the code executes. So let's fill in some fields but leave other fields blank, and we'll leave the remaining fields blank. So we'll go ahead and hit the submit button. So now here we are in the debugger inside the dialog validate event, and at this point we've taken the definition, the JSON definition of the form, and passed it. So we have a P is now an XBasic array with an entry for each field in the form. So the first field, for example, right now is the first name field, and we can see that its required property is set to true. And if we also go here and look at e.data submitted, we can see that date of birth, favorite color, first name and last name are just regular text fields, but skills is an array basically. So, and the skills array right now is empty. So if we go now and step through this, so the first field, data I, is Fred, and since Fred is not equal to blank, we don't generate an error. Then the next field over here, let's go here and change that to an I, is last name, and last name is also not blank, so there's no error. Then we get to the date of birth field over here, and this field is blank, so we're going to generate an error. We're going to take our error text and say date of birth is required, and then step over it. and then we're going to get to our next field, which is our favorite color. But again, there's so here favorite color is in fact empty, so we're going to generate an error. And then when we get to our next field, the skills field, we can see now that the skills field is an array. So the type of data underbar P is a pointer, which is how an array data will show up. And then we call the dump method, so there's no data in the array, so dump is equal to blank, and this is now going to generate an error over there, so we set the error. So go ahead now and run this, and we'll see now that we've got our errors over there. So now the final point is to talk about how we're actually going to submit this data into a database. So in order to keep things simple, instead of having a database that has individual fields for first name, last name, date of birth, etc., we're going to basically create a simple database that just simply has three fields. A field called ID, a field called date submitted, and then another field called form data JSON, which is going to be a long text field or a memo field that contains all of the submitted data in JSON format. And the reason that we're using this JSON format is that we now have a very flexible format here. If we change the questions that are on the or the fields that are on the form, we don't have to worry about changing the schema of the backend database. So we're just going to capture the data in a JSON string. So let's go ahead now and let's go back to design mode now. Go back to our after validate event over here, and I'm going to just let's see. First, let me just run it, and then I'll walk you through the actual code itself. So let's go ahead and run this now. So go ahead and run, and I'll take out those debug statements. So let's go back to our dialog validate and take out that debug statement. So we'll go ahead now and we have one more debug statement left in. Let's go ahead now to our XBasic code here and take out this debug statement. So now we can go ahead and run the form. So we'll go there and we'll type in, say, Fred Smith 12/1/2000. His favorite color is red, and his skills are XBasic, JavaScript, and HTML. Go ahead and hit the submit button so we get our message back, data was saved, and then the form is cleared out. So let's pause now and pick it up in the next video where we take a look at what's happened in the database. So if we look in the SQL database, we can see a new record got added to the database. There's the date submitted over there, and inside the form data JSON we have the JSON representation of the data that was submitted. So there's first name, etc., and then you can see that in our skills we have an array of XBasic, JavaScript, and HTML. So we submitted the data, a new record got created, and the data got put into the database in JSON format. So let's go now and take a look at the server-side code that gets executed when we submit the form, and I'm going to just walk through the code in debug mode because it'll be easier to explain that way. So let's go there now and type in a new record. So type in, say, John Jones 1/1/1999 and blue and HTML and JavaScript, then hit the submit button. So here we are inside our code. So the first thing that we do is we open up our connection to the SQL database. In this case we have a MariaDB database, but that really doesn't matter. It could be any SQL database. And then here's our SQL insert statement. So we have a table called dynamic forms, and that table has columns called ID, which is an auto increment field, and then it also has date submitted and form data JSON. So our insert statement, our SQL insert statement, is insert into dynamic forms the two fields that we want to insert, and then the SQL arguments to represent the data values. Then we create a SQL arguments object, so and we add a property for the date argument. We set that to today's date. And then for the JSON field, we just take e.data_submitted and we turn that into a JSON string. So if we go here and look at e.data_submitted, basically we see there's e.data_submitted, and by just calling JSON.generate on that string, on e.data_submitted, we get basically the JSON representation of the data that was submitted. We set the JSON argument to that value over there, and then we basically call the execute method to execute that SQL. The flag says true, so there was no error, and we then send back a JavaScript response that says alert, data was saved. Now obviously if this flag had come back to false, we wouldn't want to set our JavaScript to data was saved. We want to report an error back to the user. And now the next thing that we want to do is clear out the form so that the user can now move on to the next record. So we need to generate a JavaScript response that's going to set all the fields on the form back to their blank values. So in order to do that, we just simply take e.data_submitted and do a properties enum on that, which gives us the list of fields that were submitted. So you can see fields there now is a CRLF delimited list of fields, and then we write some JavaScript that is generating. Let's go take a look at what we've just generated. So at this point we've just generated some JavaScript that creates a new JavaScript variable called underbar D, which is a blank object, and then we've set underbar D first name to a blank string, and then we go through this, we set last name, etc. You can see here we're setting the field properties in this underbar D object to blank, and then finally we basically call the .populate method and then set our JavaScript response to that. So now we basically generated our JavaScript response. You can see now that the form is going to be set back to clean, and also the form is no longer, the fields have been set back to empty, and the form is no longer dirty. Now if we had wanted after the user filled in the form to go to some other page, we could just as easily have added to our JavaScript response something that set location.href. So we could, for example, here just go to bing.com after the user submits the form, but that's just an additional wrinkle that you can use. So what you've seen here is a great example of how dynamic forms can be used